Step into the shadows with us at Paranormal M, where the paranormal takes center stage. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to embark on a journey through the supernatural. We hope you're ready for a spine-tingling experience. Story number 1. A Mexican ranch tale of witches and mysterious lights. In the spirit of the spooky season, I've decided to share one of the paranormal stories that my mom used to tell me. To give you some context, I come from a Mexican-American background. Although I was born in the United States, my parents were born in Mexico and spent most of their early years there. Here's one of the many eerie tales that my mom would recount from her own childhood. My mother grew up in the Mexican countryside, on a ranch where houses were scattered far apart. Nighttime brought pitch-black darkness due to the absence of the streetlights. One day she was walking to a party with her brother and sister in the early afternoon. It wasn't dark yet. As they made their way through the remote area, my mom happened to glance up at the sky and noticed a mysterious light that was moving about. She kept this sighting to herself, knowing all too well that it was rumored to be a witch, a common belief in many parts of Mexico. They get to the party and enjoyed the party, but momentarily forgetting about the odd sight. However, when the party ended around midnight, they began their journey back home through the now pitch-black countryside. Halfway there, the inexplicable light appeared in the sky once more. And this time her siblings also saw it. They continued walking in silence, not daring to mention the eerie sight to one another. Then out of the blue, my mom tripped, turned to look behind her, catching a fleeting glimpse of a mysterious lady. Almost instantaneously, the figure transformed into a glowing light and ascended into the sky. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Story number 2. Another story about a witch. Hey guys, I had a conversation with my mom today. I managed to coax another chilling tale from her. This time the story revolved around her grandmother's experiences in the early 1900s. Her grandma was in her 20s, residing in a remote ranch in the mountainous regions of rural Mexico, surrounded by very few houses. There was a local belief that witches would prey on newborns, particularly if they hadn't been baptized. Her grandma had recently given birth to a baby, and one eerie night, she and her husband awoke to the sound of their infant's ceaseless cries, accompanied by the eerie howling of their dogs. What unsettled them even more was the strange flapping of wings on their roof, reminiscent of a chicken or a rooster. Without delay, they realized it could be none other than a witch. They hastily snatched the baby, nestled in between them, clutching him tightly. During that time, there was no electricity. Her husband, summoning his courage, attempted to light a candle, but it kept flickering out mysteriously. He returned to bed, and they both remained vigilant. Strangely, though, they felt as if they were under a spell, unable to stay awake, gradually drifted into an inexplicable slumber. Upon waking the next morning, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. A pool of blood had formed around them, and the baby lay lifeless, bearing a small snake-like bite on his neck. Story number 3. He took his soul. Hey everyone, I'm back with another spine-tingling tale, but this time it's from my girlfriend, and it revolves around her grandfather. As always, these stories are recounted exactly as they remember them, and 100% true. So picture this. It's the early 1900s in rural Guatemala, where the story unfolds. One misty morning around 5 a.m. when the sun was just beginning to pierce through the darkness, their grandpa embarked on a journey to the neighboring town. In this remote region, there were only scattered houses, each separated by miles of empty land. The path he trod was a winding dirt road, and the morning air was thick with fog. As he ventured forth, he noticed a figure ahead. An ordinary-looking person, or so it seemed. Her grandpa didn't give it much thought. Perhaps just another early riser on their way to town. However, as they drew closer, this stranger turned and greeted her grandpa with a friendly hello. Engaging in casual conversation, they both revealed that they were headed to the same destination. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until out of the blue the stranger mentioned his fatigue and decided to rest on a nearby rock. He urged her grandpa to continue on without him. With no reason to be suspicious, her grandpa continued walking, but felt a strange compulsion to glance over his shoulder. To his astonishment, the man had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind him. A shiver ran down her grandpa's spine, and his entire body broke out in goosebumps. The air around him turned cold, and it became hard to catch his breath. He couldn't help but think that it might have been a spirit all along. In a panic, her grandpa made a quick decision. He turned on his heels and hurried back home. Little did he know that within a week he would draw his last breath. Many believed it was the work of a malevolent spirit, robbing his soul in that encounter. Our experience with automatic writing. My husband and I have been watching a lot of Sam and Colby lately and are absolutely addicted. We've also been watching Selena Spooky Boo and Chris. If you like ghost hunting shows, I highly recommend both of their YouTube channels. Of all the methods that they use to contact spirits, we both were very interested in the automatic writing that Selena likes to use a lot. My husband tends to be very in tune with his spiritual side and has had success with meditation in the past. So the other night, we basically decided to just give it a try. First, some background info. I, a 30-year-old male, met my husband, a 29-year-old male, back in 2012. In 2013, my husband's uncle passed away by suicide, and we, along with my future in-laws, moved into the house where his uncle lived with his parents, who would be my husband's grandparents. From 2013 to 2016, both of those grandparents and also his great-grandmother would also pass away. Needless to say, there were plenty of people that could possibly come through for my husband, so he found a white noise playlist on Spotify. He blindfolded himself, and we started. I said that what everybody else says at first. Is there anybody here that would like to speak with my husband? First there was nothing, but... Excuse me? But eventually the pen started to move, and the first word appeared, rough but distinctive. It said box. I honestly was not expecting a word to appear right away. I should point out that my husband has a very, very, very neat handwriting, and almost exclusively writes in cursive. But this word was very shaky and jagged. I said the word out loud and waited. Eventually, my husband wrote a second word, under, just under the word box, but in cursive this time. I was a little spooked that this could actually be making sense, so I said nothing and let him continue. He started writing a third word, this time almost on the edge of the paper away from the first two words, but it was again very clear, bed, box under bed. There's no way this is actually working, I thought to myself, but I went ahead and asked hesitantly, "What's in the box?" Almost instantly his hand went to the middle of the paper and quickly wrote, "Me." Instantly freaked out, I tapped my husband's shoulder to take him out of the session. He asked why I took him out so quickly. It had been maybe 2 minutes, and I showed him what he had wrote. He sat and stared at the words for a minute, then let out a small gasp. Out of all the people who had recently lived in the house and passed away, there was still one who had not been laid to rest. His grandfather's ashes were in a box downstairs in his parents' closet. One of his last wishes was to be buried here on the property. He helped nurture for so many years rather than to be buried in a cemetery, but my husband's parents just hadn't gotten around to it. Their closet is almost directly under where our bed would have been when he was still alive. Now a futon sits there where my husband frequently naps. With this information, my husband asked if he could, try it again. I was a little apprehensive, but said yes, and he went under again. And this time I waited before I said anything, just to see what would happen. After a few seconds, he began writing. I looked over his shoulder and saw the word tree. He then started drawing what I thought looked like a cloud, but he stopped just on top of it. He then drew 2 lines coming from the cloud-like object, quickly realized that I was looking at a drawing of what he wrote, a tree. After another few seconds, he started to write another word. I looked down and almost couldn't believe what he wrote next. Bury, followed by an intense underlining of the tree drawing. He wanted to be buried by a tree. Now, I know what some of you might say, that my husband now had a preconceived notion of who he was talking to and may even be faking what he was writing. After we were done, my husband assured me that he had next to no idea what he was actually writing. We've been together over 10 years, so he has no reason to lie about something like this. Believe what you want to believe, but for those who do believe, there's more. He continued, and the next word that he wrote were tree and me again. He then began drawing the cloud-shaped object again, which I eventually recognized as the top of the tree. But this time there was no tree trunk, just leaves, and there were some dot-like objects after, almost like ellipses. Then suddenly he wrote the word don't in all caps. At this point I hadn't really said much, but I was concerned about the word don't, so I decided to ask if that was indeed the grandfather's name. My husband wrote 2 of the same words again, tree and bury. The word bury overlapped the words, so I turned the page for him. This last bit is honestly a little hazy to me, but the first thing that he did on the new page was draw some type of jagged symbol. We still don't quite know what it is or what it means. But after that, he wrote the word yes. The only yes or no question I'd asked was if this really was his grandfather. He then wrote the word closet, which would make sense because his ashes were in the closet, and then the word stairs. As I was trying to figure out what stairs had to do with anything, my husband wrote his final word, please. With that, I decided to go ahead and tap on my husband's shoulder and bring him out of the session. We then talked about everything that had happened, His grandfather absolutely loved everything about nature, flowers, and animals, so it made sense that he would ask to be buried outside after spending the last 8 or so years in a closet. Oddly enough, at one point my in-laws had even talked about buying one of those trees that you plant with the loved one's ashes, so the tree part made a lot of sense too. Also, his grandfather used to tell my husband when he was a kid that he wanted to be buried in his garden. The tree with no trunk and then the word "don't" symbolized to us that he didn't want to be buried in his garden, but rather near or as a tree instead. We still don't know what the stairs was about, but the weird symbol thing almost looked like a flight of stairs. I'll post the pictures in the comments if I can, but let me know what you guys think. I promise this is 100% real, and we're still talking about it days later. We've made plans to make sure that we lay him to rest this coming spring. Spirits cooking in my kitchen. Please tell me I'm not the only one that's experienced this. So I'm fairly certain that my house is haunted on some level. I don't know why, or what spirit may or may not be in here, or what the history of the house is. Other than that it was built in 2008, and I've never even done a cursory Google search on it. A little afraid of learning things I don't want to know. I'm about an hour outside of Phoenix, Arizona, in the rural desert. Could be built on ancient Native American burial grounds for all I know. I moved here 8 years ago, and within a couple of months of moving in, I started hearing faint noises. I couldn't account for them. Kind of reminded me of the noises that the early 1900s houses I had living in Detroit would make. Pipes creaking, banging, walls creaking, windows rattling when it got windy, steam boiler kicking on and off, just at much lower volumes. I've seen things in the past in Michigan that I can only describe as apparitions. But this current house, it now has all plastic pipes inside, all electric appliances, electric heat, modern double-pane windows. No reason to be hearing old house sounds. Would never be enough to wake me up at night. Was never obnoxious. I've never felt afraid of it. I'd occasionally joke about the ghosts, and always just figured it was my super cheap appliances doing weird things, though the dishwasher would occasionally just turn itself on and run the cycle. Then a couple of months after that, I swear I could smell things being cooked in the kitchen. I'm the only one in the house, don't even have an inside pet. I'd wake up some mornings to the distinct smell of blueberry muffins or pancakes. Sometimes I'd come home from work and swear there was a hot pizza waiting for me. There's been times I've caught the smell of marijuana, and I don't smoke at all, neither do my neighbors. 8 years later, it still happens every few months. Story number 6. Creepy stairs at my childhood home and other strange occurrences. This took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. So we had internet, but it was a slow dial-up connection. I don't remember Google really being a thing yet. When I was around 9 or 10, my mom got remarried. We moved into a bigger house to accommodate our now family of 5. Most of the houses in the neighborhood were built in the 70s or 80s. The house was okay overall, 3 bedrooms, 2-bath ranch style with a finished basement. One weird thing about the house was the feeling I got on the staircase that led downstairs. It's hard to explain, but I got the worst feeling on the staircase every time I had ever had to use it. Coming and going. Like you were going to be pushed or pulled down the stairs. was a finished downstairs area with a built-in bar and a lot of living space, so it's not like it was a creepy basement. It was completely irrational, but I hated that staircase. We later found out that the man who lived there had previously died in this house. Not sure of his manner of death, but his widow didn't bother to pick up man cave downstairs, and we were left with a lot of his belongings. I never talked to my family about the weird feeling on the staircase and chalked it up to my imagination. When we were moving out of the house, I asked every member of my family separately if they had ever had any weird experiences in the house. Every single person, without prompting, said they felt uneasy on the stairs, like they were going to be snuck up on or grabbed. There was a strange experience that my stepdad at the time told me about. One weekend, him and my mom were laying in bed in the morning. It was a weekend that his kids were with their grandparents, and I was at my dad's. So they had the house to themselves. My mom got up to make coffee, and her husband was still sleepily laying in bed. He was facing away from the doorway with his eyes closed when he heard my mom walk back into the room and plop down in the bed. The floors were hardwood, so it was easy to hear. He started to talk to her about their plans for the day. When she didn't answer, he rolled over to see my mom wasn't in the room, but there was an imprint of somebody sitting at the foot of the bed. He got freaked out and left the house for the day. We would all often hear footsteps and doors would open and close on their own. There were times where things would go missing only to be found in the middle of a room previously searched. Lots of weird feelings and little things. I would get nightmares and struggled with insomnia. Not sure if it was related, but it only ever happened in that house. One time the old industrial whole house attic fan that we hadn't worked on in years came on in the middle of watching a paranormal movie, blowing papers everywhere and being loud as fuck, scaring everybody until we figured out what was happening. Nothing super crazy, but still the weird gut feeling that you would get in that house. They were intense. Story number 7. One of my many strange experiences in the woods of Appalachia. When I was in high school about 15 years ago, a group of friends and I were hanging out at our friend Dale's house. For some backstory, we lived way out in the country, also technically part of Appalachia. The kind of middle of nowhere where the nearest neighbors are a few miles up the road. Dale happened to have a cave near his property that we'd like to explore and be dumb teenagers in. To get to the cave, you had to walk roughly a mile through dense woods and cross a big field. We had yet to find the end of the cave system despite exploring for hours and multiple times. One day we had spent the better part of the afternoon exploring the caves, and it had gotten dark by the time that we emerged. We already had flashlights, so it was no big deal. My memory is a little fuzzy on the exact details, but for some reason our friend Sam decided to go back to the house a little earlier. I want to say that we ordered a pizza or something and he went to meet the driver. The rest of us started making our way back through the woods to Dale's house when we started hearing voices in the woods. We were asking each other if we heard that and where it came from, but we each had a different direction of where we thought it was coming from. It was a childlike voice, and it sounded like talking or whispering, but you couldn't make out what was being said. At this point, we thought one of our friends was messing with us and started to talk back to it. It sounded like a child giggling, and then our flashlight started to flicker and die. We had one dim light left to get to the rest of the way back. We were all thoroughly freaked out, prank or not, and hightailed it back to the house, adrenaline pumping. We all got in the house, shut the door, and I felt a sense of safety for a split second before the crucifix on the wall literally came off the wall and broke on the floor. It literally seems like something out of a bad horror movie. But we all watched it legitimately come off the wall and crash to the ground for no apparent reason. Before that moment, I hadn't been convinced it wasn't our friend Sam that was messing with us, even though he really wasn't the type. We all started word vomiting at Sam, trying to explain what had just happened and question if he had something to do with it, but he genuinely seemed freaked out and confused. He actually said that on his way back to the house earlier, that he kept hearing weird things and seeing lights in the woods, and he thought it was us trying to play a prank on him. I don't know what it was. Maybe your friend's a great actor, but I honestly don't think it was a prank. Feeling I got in the woods like every hair was standing on end, goosebumps on my goosebumps, and every fiber of my being screaming to run. I've never felt like that again, and I never want to. Story number 9. Black-eyed kids. My grandma encountered 3 of them. They asked her if they can come in. We have a garden with a balcony door which leads to the living room. They didn't look directly at her. They stared at the floor. One of them asked her if they could use their phone to call their parents. My grandma told me that she never felt such dread but thought nothing of it, because they were kids. She just said, yes, and let them in. She told me that they had finally looked at her in the eyes when they were so black. She never saw something like this ever in her life. She froze and just watched them walk into the hallway out of sight. Then my grandma followed after a second or two and they were gone, simply vanished into thin air. She was genuinely scared and confused when she told me this. My grandmother would never make up such things or even talk about the paranormal in general, let alone having access to the internet, because she simply doesn't understand how all this works. Never used a computer in her life. She's a Turkish grandma from an old generation. I Googled and froze after reading about this phenomena. This happened 7 years ago, and the story is startling me every time when I think about it. Poor grandma. Can a painting be cursed? Not safe for work warning. You've been warned. I was riding my bike to work last Monday and I saw a woman putting some things on the roadside in front of a house, so I couldn't resist stopping to see what it was in the boxes. Not much was in the first box, just some useless household items like kitchen utensils, a few candles, some dried flowers with all the petals gone. But in the second box, there was only this small painting of a letter, the letter E. It's not a great painting, but immediately caught my eye. I had to grab it, put it in my backpack, and started riding again, and I wasn't more than half a block away, and my tire blew out, causing me to wreck. Now, it doesn't strike me as weird that it happens to a lot of people every day. And that's what I thought at first. But then, because of the wreck and the flat tire, almost made me about an hour late for work. I got fired from my job, tried to call work and explain that I was going to be late, but my phone was completely destroyed in that wreck. I got home that night when I took off my backpack, tossed it in the recliner, and when I did, it accidentally got caught on a lamp, causing it to fall and break. So I went to clean up the glass and cut my finger really bad after I got the bleeding to stop. I went to bed but kept having these really vivid nightmares. I would wake up and feel like I wasn't alone in my room, like my backpack was watching me somehow. Tuesday when I woke up, I went to grab my backpack and remembered the painting was in there. So I took it and I set it on the table, so I thought. But after I got home, the painting was now on the floor next to the table. I'm almost certain that I put the painting on the table, but it's not where I found it when I got home. I decided to hang the painting on the wall next to my bed, but I now feel uncomfortable being around the painting. I feel as if it's watching me, And every night since the painting has been in my house, I've had terrible nightmares. And ever since I've had the painting, I felt tired and weak. My friends said that they want me to get rid of that painting, but I just can't bring myself to throw it away. It can't be the painting's fault, right? Story number 11. Running on the roof. Not safe for work warning, although the last story seemed pretty safe to me, so warning or not warning, your call. Alright, I just want to make sure I ain't crazy. I'm a huge believer when it comes to paranormal things. I grew up in a house that always has been filled with entities. There's always some creepy shit happening, like things moving around, doors opening and closing, someone walking in the hallways, and voices. It's been almost 2 years now that I hardly haven't heard anything. Things calm down. It's not as bad as how it was when I was younger, but I've noticed that whenever I talk to anybody about what's happened, suddenly things start happening again. Last Saturday, me and my brother were on a road trip and we started talking about paranormal stuff and things that people have been seeing lately. I always enjoyed a huge scare, but we both knew that when we talk about those things, something is bound to happen. And it did. This morning, everybody left for work and I was alone in the house. I was getting ready to run some errands. I suddenly started hearing noises, like things falling or being thrown or small footsteps. I didn't think much about it, only because sometimes we have cats that are on the roof and they tend to fight or do whatever they do up there. But this time I had this eerie feeling that something wasn't right. As I was getting ready to leave, I heard something run from one side of the roof to the other. I'm talking about actual footsteps of someone running so fucking fast. It scared the shit out of me to the point that the fear I had made me literally cry. I never heard something like that before, so I'm just gonna hope it was a raccoon or something on the roof. What made matters worse is I had to leave to run some errands, so best believe that my ass was paranoid and didn't even want to look on that roof. Story number 12. Something strange. Me and my friend were driving 2 weekends ago from the Bay Area back to our homes in Santa Cruz. Highway 17 is the final twisty, narrow forest highway that takes you into Santa Cruz. It's a notoriously dangerous drive, lots of deaths, and generally just dark forest, spooky vibes. Most of the highway has no shoulder, just rock face or trees directly next to the road. It's a 16-mile stretch with no gas stations or really anything minus a few homes tucked away. It was 3 a.m. We were just about 4 miles deep coming up the hill, and we saw a man standing on the side of the road. He was facing away from us. He was standing straight and perfectly still, all black clothing including some type of hat. There were very few cars coming by, maybe one a minute. He must have been standing there still, even before we had come around the corner. He was just staring at the forest, about 5 feet from the edge of the road on a very narrow shoulder. He wasn't relaxed, was like stiff and straight with his arms out a little bit wider than what would be typical and comfortable. It was so unsettling. The most unsettling part is that there were no parked cars for the 4 miles prior to seeing him, and no parked cars for another 6 miles after. And we counted, but he was just alone somehow on the side of the highway and not able to be walked along. I guess what they're saying is that you can't walk on that highway. I'm not sure what to make of it, but it has definitely stuck with me and haunted me ever since. Story number 13. Sorry for the loud raid noise. And just to address some of the comments saying that the audio is incredibly screwed up and that I need a new mic, I just want to let you know that that's nothing I can control. I send them stuff at a really high quality, and then they seem to upload it or edit it on whatever video editor that they use, and completely destroys the audio, which makes me quite a bit depressed because I have a very nice microphone and I'm a musician, so sound matters to me. So, if you guys can put up with the rain, and if you guys can hear the rain. Story number 13. The New Neighbor. Me and my wife moved into our home a little under 2 years ago. The first year we had some interesting interactions with the locals of our new town. They told us stories of our home and the father and son who had both passed away in the house. The father of old age and the son of a heart attack shortly after. I was on the fence of believing in the paranormal until we started noticing objects moving like our dog's balls and toys at first. Until it turned into larger objects like shoes and decorations. Odd objects that didn't belong in our yard showing up on the back stairs. Things like door hinges and random pieces of ceramic. The house across from us was assumed abandoned, even though we saw people every now and then going inside, until recently when a middle-aged man showed up to live there. Immediately after moving in, he got 2 younger pit bull puppies. Both of them were white with brown spots on them. Me being a smoker, I go out nightly around 12 or 11 for my final cigarette. I noticed some strange noises coming from the backyard and never really thought much of it. The other day, my wife asked me if the gray dog had always been over there. And now I noticed that the second white and brown dog had been replaced with a gray dog. Nothing I was very stressed about until tonight. While out on my smoke, I noticed a pack of deer in the field behind the neighbors. Normally our deer are terrified of humans, but this man just calmly walked through the pack, as if they didn't even notice he was there. He bent down to try and pet his puppy, who seemed to growl and back away from him. He looked over at me when this happened and slowly stood up and continued into the home. No lights turned on when he went inside. Being a little freaked out by the situation, I made my way inside slowly. I sat on the couch for a few moments so I could look out my living room window and keep an eye on his house. Still no movement or lights for about 10 minutes. Then the blinds slowly slid open that face my house. I turned off the lights in my home and made my way to the bedroom where I'm typing this story now. If anyone has any idea of what's going on, I'd appreciate some help, maybe or advice, anything on where to go with this. I was thinking maybe a skinwalker or a watcher of some sort. Maybe one of y'all have some information I could read into. Story number 14. Shadow Figure Downtown. I stayed with my buddy and his family for a bit when I was homeless in 2016. We got off of work at about 1 a.m. most nights. There's a 24-hour coin-operated laundromat not too far from where we stayed. We were both night owls at the time, so we walked up to do a couple of loads of laundry. We were playing a pinball machine inside that was themed after cheesy 80 action movies. And in the middle of one of our games, the flippers stopped being responsive and then started flipping on their own. And it played a creepy Halloween-sounding music followed by the whole building smelling like sulfur. So we both sat outside on the beach, waited for our clothes to dry. It was probably between 2:30 and 3 a.m. at this point. Nobody else was there, at least that late, besides us, and the occasional crackhead that came by to either try to sell stuff or beg for money. And on the walk home, I looked down one of the streets that we were crossing and saw a shadow standing directly in the middle of the streets with both of its arms stretched out and its head tilted to the side like it was mimicking Jesus on the cross. I looked at him and asked if he saw it too. He said that he did, and when we both looked back, it was 200 feet up the street from where it originally was, but going the opposite direction as us. We both walked as fast as we could back home. I wish I was making this shit up, and I know most people won't believe it, but I know what we saw, and he still remembers it to this day. This was the wildest paranormal experience I've had, other than seeing shadow figures passing by in my peripheral occasion. Passing by my peripheral occasionally, I think they meant. I haven't had really many paranormal experiences since then. Evil spirits and demons tormented a childhood friend for years. I had a buddy I grew up with who had a terrible upbringing and was sexually abused by a neighbor as a young child. He claimed to be tormented by evil spirits after moving into the house in the same neighborhood where the sexual assaults took place when he was a teenager. We were around 14 or 15 at the time. He called me one night really scared, saying that his dog started barking and growling while staring at the shelf in his living room. He couldn't get it to calm down. The shelf flew off the wall into the other wall. Other friends of mine saw objects get thrown when they were over his house too. Around this time he tried to kill himself like 3 or 4 times in a span of 2 to 3 years. He was using a lot of substances and in a toxic codependent relationship with a girl who he had gotten pregnant. His life was not good or normal for a kid his age. He was on a break with his girl at the time, and he called me and told me that he did some sort of ritual to sell his soul to the devil, and used a picture of the girl that he was seeing and cut himself. Used the blood and the picture in it somehow. I just kind of brushed it off, but it scared the absolute shit out of me. One night we were smoking weed with his younger brother at his house, and he broke out into crazy laughter. He couldn't stop for literally 10 to 15 minutes straight. Then his brother started getting incredibly scared and yelling, stop it, please." He just wouldn't. I just sat there kind of freaked out, not really knowing what to do. When he finally stopped laughing like a madman, he got really serious and said, "I was just fucking with you. Guys, stop being pussies." Wanted to drop it like it never happened, but it just kind of stayed in a serious and angry mood until we went back to bed that night. It didn't feel like a prank or him just messing around at all. It was one of the most odd things I've ever witnessed. I slept on their living room floor that night, and him and his brother slept in the bedroom that they shared. I woke up early the next morning and they both were still asleep, at least for a couple of hours, and I heard a laugh that sounded like a stereotypical depiction of a devil laugh from a horror movie coming from their room. I got up immediately to see if they were awake. Nope, both still out cold. Just brushed it off and tried to not let it scare me. Another night during the same summer, we were smoking weed in my bedroom at my house with my other friend, and he was sitting in an armchair in the corner, and he says to us, "I just felt something crawling on my neck." Got really scared, and when we questioned him about it, he just dropped it, told us that it was nothing and to ignore it. A few minutes later, it looked like he was getting pushed back into the chair and choking. He started screaming for us to help him. It took us both a couple of minutes of struggling as hard as we could to get him up. When we asked him what had happened, he didn't want to talk about it again. It was just terrifying, and he was terrified. He insisted that we just drop it and not bring it up anymore. So we did. The reason I think that he might have been possessed for sure is because there were times where he would go from laughing and having a good time to getting extremely angry and serious. And he would say incredibly mean things for a few minutes until he would snap out of it and not even remember saying those things at all, go back to acting like nothing happened. This happened a couple of times, and paired with the laughing incident, it makes me wonder, He overdosed on fentanyl in 2009. When I think about him and his childhood being so poor and miserable, I miss him a lot. I feel like he wasn't given a fair chance in life. It makes me really sad. There's many other paranormal experiences myself and other mutual friends of ours have had while hanging around him. We all think that they were tied to him and whatever it was that followed him. Story number 16. Hereditary imaginary friend or demon. My father was the firstborn child, and he had an imaginary friend named Miku. When I was young, I had an imaginary friend named the same thing. I found out when my dad got us a pet python and named it Miku. Not sure how it's spelled, but that's how it's said or pronounced. And he told me his imaginary friend when he was little was also named this as well. I always felt that my imaginary friend kept me safe from danger and evil. But as I've gotten older, I wonder if it was something paranormal or like a demon passed down to the firstborn child through the bloodline sort of thing. I would draw picture after picture of me holding a chain leading to a collar on a monster. But the monster was always so big you couldn't see its head, only its paws and chest. As I got older, I got deep into addiction and began living in really bad areas. The first man I ran with and who protected me was named Meek. The second, and the one I dated for years, was named Mook. The second had done time for murder. They both hurt anyone who hurt me. Weirdest thing was that Mook always told me that he'd be with me all of my life and he's always been with me. It's easy to dismiss as ramblings of a mentally ill drug addict, but he had details from my life from before we even met that seemed impossible. He also told me that he'll always come back to me as love. Not as him, but as love. And he'll always be with me and protect me. A horrifying spook that I had. Story number 17. When I think back on this experience, it makes me so uneasy. For context, my mom was a single mother, and I'm an only child, meaning that I spent a lot of time home alone as a kid. We lived in a small house in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. And this house was just built before we moved in, so I always thought it was weird that I experienced paranormal things here. I would usually play outside with neighborhood friends while waiting for my mom to get home around 5 or 6 to avoid the slightly creepy feeling that I had alone in that house. This happened when I was about 11 or 12, so I was becoming less interested in playing outside and more interested spending time on the computer. This was back when there was a designated room in your house for the computer. It was a 3-bedroom, single-story house, and the kitchen and living room were on one end, and then you'd go through the living room to get to the long hallway on the other side of the house where the bedrooms were. The garage was connected and in front of the kitchen, and there was a door connecting the two. My mom would always park the car in the garage and walk in through the kitchen, and then she'd have to walk through the living room to get to the hallway. Anyway, the living room had hardwood floors, and my mom always wore heels. Every evening I would hear the same sequence of noises letting me know where my mom was, basically, as I was usually in the computer room. The garage door opening, the door into the house opening and closing, and then her heels while she would walk on the hardwood floor. This particular day it was sunny outside. I had the blinds open to the window facing the street, and I had been home from school for a couple of hours, so it was probably 3:45 or 4 p.m. I was sitting at the computer, probably on MySpace, and I was totally zoned out. Then I heard the sequence of noises. The garage, the opening of the door to the house and the closing, and her heels while walking through the living room. I remember thinking how weird it was that she was home so early, so I was excited to see her, so I called out, "Mom!" Went into the hallway and no one was there. I had a sick feeling instantly and then went in to check the garage, thinking that I would for sure see her. I opened the door to the garage and my stomach dropped. There was no car. She wasn't home. I got so freaked out I remembered running back into the computer room at the end of the house, grabbing my cell phone and then running out the front door. I can't remember what I did for the rest of the evening while waiting for my mom to get home, but I probably went to my neighbor's. I may have called my mom as well, but she worked an office job and rarely was able to answer her cell. However, I do remember telling my mom what happened when she came home that night. She didn't seem to want to talk about it at all or really even believe me. That was one of the many weird things that happened at that house occasionally. After moving away, I never had anything like that happen. I sometimes wonder if maybe the house was built on an Indian burial ground or something had an energetic attachment to me. Whatever it was, it felt bad and obviously was trying to trick me. Hearing the heels walking through the living room is always what freaked me out the most. I have a few other stories from when I lived there I may share, but this is one of the times I felt most scared. Story number 18, George. When I was a kid, my mom would take me to the boathouse at the beach quite often. I remember the sounds, the smells, the equipment, and George. George was about 70 years old. He had skin like leather and a buckled jaw with large fake white teeth. He always sported the same baseball cap and had a huge grin on his face. Everyone knew George because he talked to everybody, but I remember him vividly because of the way that he would flirt with my mom. My mom, being so friendly, was always very kind to him, and I guess I got to know him better this way. Throughout my childhood, I'd always see him in the same spot, the same lawn chair, just hanging out. I would sometimes say hello or otherwise just pass by. On this particular afternoon, it was a hot summer day and the beach was jammed. My friend and I decided that we'd have enough and made our way back to my place. On our way back, I saw George sitting in his chair. At first, I felt awkward, not sure if I should say hello. As I got closer, I turned and made eye contact. That's when he raised his hand and said, "Say hi to your mom for me." I smiled, waved, and nodded. My friend and I got back to my place and are grabbing drinks and snacks while my mom is preparing something in the kitchen. I turn to my mom and I say, "George says hi, by the way." And she froze. "What?" my mom asked. "George says hi," I repeated. She had a grim look on her face and looked pale. My friend and I didn't know what was wrong. I asked if she was okay, and she responded by saying, "That wasn't George. You couldn't have seen him because he died 2 weeks ago." I sat down immediately, broke down, and cried. It was heartbreaking, but this was out of fear. Never in my life have I felt this way. It was so incredibly vivid and seemed surreal. In the end, it was nice to know that he was in his happy place, but he was sitting in his lawn chair looking out the water. So, rest in peace, George. Story number 19, Ghost Who Steals Food. I'll start this story with the remark that out of the whole family, I'm the only one susceptible to the paranormal. Since childhood, I've encountered inexplicable and strange phenomena, and none of them repeated themselves. This is the apartment that my parents rent. Lately, there have been a lot of noises in the kitchen. My family noticed this too when we all gathered in the same room to watch a movie. Before this, though, there were also other paranormal cases here. Something definitely lives in the kitchen, Literally less than half of an hour ago, it happened again. This time it was not black shadows, footsteps in the corridor, or monsters. It was a ghost thief. It's 1 a.m. and I'm sitting in the kitchen drinking tea, learning to snap my fingers loudly, when suddenly an apple fell from a loud cabinet. It fell right behind the cabinet, and yes, we store fruit on the cabinet, not in it. I immediately understood everything from the sound without even looking, but it was strange. Literally 10 minutes before, I had to move all the apples away from the edge so that they wouldn't fall. The second strange thing is that when I looked at which apple fell, it was a green apple, not a red one. The green apples generally lay in the opposite direction. Then I didn't really think about the details, and so it wouldn't rot there, I took a long broom and began pushing the apple behind the cabinet on high legs. Under this cabinet there were 2 boxes with onion and potatoes, but when I moved them aside and looked underneath the cabinet, there was no apple. This confused me. I started running the broom over all the places where the apple could have been rolled, but it simply disappeared without a trace. I swear I heard it fall, and I saw a couple of times before it disappeared. Story number 20. My mom saw a guy from the 30s. This one is not my story, although I have many, but it's from my mom. Here it goes. She told me that when her and my dad bought their very first house together, standard 2 up, 2 down in the city of Birmingham, UK. She said that Dad would always arrive home earlier than her from work on weekdays. So when she got off the bus and walked in the door, she was surprised, but not concerned, to find my dad wasn't home yet. She put the kettle on and went to go upstairs to change out of her work attire. As she looked up towards the landing, she said she saw a man in army clothes, and says that she saw him hanging from the ceiling. I'll also add that my mom has a very strong connection with the other side, and has plenty of other weird stories that she's told me. Anyway, she started to scream and runs outside into the garden and waits until my dad gets home, and then tells him what she saw. My dad, being an absolute non-believer, shrugs it off and says that she's mental. Anyway, a few days later, their neighbors, who were in their 60s or 70s, were out pottering around about the front garden, and Mom gets to chatting with them. She told them that she felt uneasy and that she feels like there's someone lingering in the house, and told them what she'd seen, apprehensively, as she didn't want them to think she was mental too. Remember, this was in the 70s. The old lady said that that's not the first time somebody's had strange feelings in the house, and it's not surprising. She told my mom there was a lad who had been called to go join the army back in the war, but refused to go, and ultimately hid upstairs in the loft for months on end, hiding from the police or army or whatever. He got so paranoid and scared that he hung himself up there, and his parents found him. My mom always said that she didn't find the presence scary or malicious, just knew somebody was there who shouldn't be anymore. And obviously, with what she saw, she kind of knew that somebody didn't quite know what world he should have been in. Very sad. She said that he stayed there until she kept speaking to him when she was alone in the house. She basically explained what had happened and that he no longer has to hide anymore and to go enjoy the next part of the journey on the other side. Eventually, the weird stuff did stop. God love him. Story number 21. What are some of your unexplained experiences that also had a witness? When I was in high school, I lived in a neighborhood that had a big park area down the street. During breaks, all the neighborhood kids would go down and hang out, and we were all pretty good friends. There were a couple of ramadas that were pretty well lit, and we could hang out at the tables often at night. There were 2 tables, both like diagonal, One side you had facing the pathway up to the Ramada, and the other side had you facing the grass area and basketball courts. My friend Matt and I were on the side facing the pathway, and suddenly there was what looked like a teenage boy run past and duck behind a trash can that was right in front of us. We both stood up immediately and looked at each other and basically at the same time asked, "Did you see that?" I saw a young guy wearing a white t-shirt and a white hat. We both asked each other questions, one at a time, to kind of test if the other person did in fact see it. I asked Matt if the kid was wearing a hat, and he said, "Yeah, it was white." Of course, we got up and checked the trash can, and there was no one there, no sign of movement behind it. It was kind of in the middle of an empty dirt patch between the parking lot and some foliage, but not away enough where if somebody was sneaking away, they would be able to see all of us who were not even looking at the area. Anyway, we just chalked it up to being a ghost. Me and him were the only ones who saw it. I have 2 other experiences that happened with other people at that park too, but this one was the first that really stuck with me. Story number 22. What would happen if you were to see this? Now, I wasn't sure if this could be considered as paranormal or not. Plus, I wanted this to be a question, but had to put gore instead since it wasn't anything medical with organs, and it's considered as one. No idea what they mean by that, sorry guys. But long story short, my mom had an enlarged heart and soon passed away due to cardiac arrest. Since I thought her gigantomasia was the cause of her breathing problems and chest pains, I was in the room speaking to the doctor, and as I left, the nurse spoke to me of what she saw during the autopsy. The enlarged heart and the dilated aneurysms were removed. There, she said, as the pathologist placed it on the table, he went out to get a drink or something, but as he did so, she was doing her report on the computer until she saw the heart starting to thump really hard by itself. At first, she was curious to see what was happening. She had never seen anything like this, until it began beating irregularly. She thought she was going crazy, but as she'd gotten close to my mom's enlarged heart, it was like that for a good few minutes. The nurse said that she could see the instruments on the table shaking due to the pounding, and hearing a disembodied heartbeat, believing that it was possessed by something, perhaps, till the pathologist arrived back when it stopped. Now, I thought it was hogwash, as she was probably pulling my leg or that she was exhausted with all the work. Now, there could be some explanation about this, as it might possibly be temporarily jump-started until stopping again. Since it was a wall-to-wall globular enlarged heart with multiple dilated aneurysms of her CVC, aorta, and pulmonary artery. But I've wondered, could spirits or souls or apparitions possess organs? It's the end of today's stories, or tonight, if it's nighttime where you are. It's nighttime where I am. So, see ya.